Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, picture this. World leaders, they're surrounded by the incredible calm of Canada's Rocky Mountains, right?
Mhm.
But inside, they're grappling with some of the world's biggest, most urgent crises.
Yeah, that was pretty much the scene at the recent G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, a meeting that was, well, full of high stakes, some unexpected drama, and pretty critical global decisions.
Absolutely. And the G7, the group of seven, it's this informal but, let's be honest, very powerful group of advanced economies.
It really is. And today, in this deep dive, we're going to unpack that summit. We'll get into the key discussions, the intense geopolitics swirling around it, and actually even a really interesting domestic Canadian policy fight that kind of mirrors some of the global challenges those leaders were talking about.
Right. So our mission today is simple. Cut through all the noise, give you a shortcut to really understanding this powerful, sometimes controversial international forum.
We want to pull out the most important insights, maybe share a few surprising facts, and just help you grasp what it all means for, well, the global picture.
Okay, let's dive in.
So for anyone who follows global stuff, G7 is a term we hear a lot, but maybe let's just quickly recap what it actually is, its core identity, and, how it got to be this influential group we see today.
Good idea. So we know the basics. 7 advanced democracies: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, the US. Plus the EU participates too. But is it just about money? What's the glue that holds the specific group together compared to, say, other global forums?
That's a really important question because beyond just their economic weight, what really defines them is a set of shared values, things like pluralism, liberal democracy, representative government. That common ground is why they bother meeting. Their main job is coordinating how they approach global economic stability, threats to peace and security, other big cross-border issues. And it's consensus-based. There's no formal treaty, no permanent headquarters building or anything, which actually gives it a certain flexibility.
That informality is interesting, isn't it? So the presidency rotates each year, and whoever's hosting gets to set the agenda priorities. But it's not just a single summit meeting once a year, right? It's more ongoing than that.
Oh, much more. Yeah, the G7 is busy all year round. You've got ministers, experts meeting constantly, working on the commitments made at the leader level. Plus, there are these really important independent groups. They call them engagement groups, like Business 7, Civil Society 7, Women 7. They hold their own summits and feed recommendations into the main process. It helps bring in different perspectives.
And then there was that really pivotal moment, was there, when they added Russia. In 1998, the G7 suddenly became the G8. That must have really shifted the group's identity, maybe sowed seeds for later problems. But before Russia, how did these countries even start meeting? Was it always this formal group?
Not at all. It started very small, very informally. It actually goes back to 1973, just a few finance ministers meeting in a library. They called it the Library Group. U.S., West Germany, France, UK. Japan joined later that year, making it the G5. Then, November 75, France and Germany pushed for Italy to join. That made it the G6 for the first summit in Rambouillet, France.
Okay, so it grew organically. Canada joins in 76, making it the G7 we know.
Yeah.
And the EU starts attending summits in 77.
Wow.
From 4 guys in a library to this global summit. And over time, their focus expanded too, didn't it? It wasn't just economics. By the 80s, they were getting into international security, conflicts.
Exactly. Now, that decision to add Russia in 98, that was largely driven by wanting to encourage its political and economic reforms, bring it into the international fold more, even though, Russia didn't really have the same kind of economy or, frankly, the same liberal democratic setup as the others. But that whole experiment, well, it came to an end.
It certainly did. Russia got suspended indefinitely in March 2014 after annexing Crimea. Then they formally pulled out in 2017. And what's interesting is how that sparked this whole debate again about expanding the G7. People talked about a D10, adding Australia and South Korea. It feels like it's not just about adding members, is it? It's sort of a proxy argument about how much the West acknowledges that global power is shifting while still trying to hang on to its own influence and values.
That's a great way to put it. And yeah, despite those expansion debates, what we see now is that non-members like India, Australia, South Korea, they get invited pretty regularly as guests. It's like the group is trying to broaden its reach, its conversations, without actually changing who's officially in the club.
Which brings us right up to Canada's latest turn hosting. Canada took over the G7 presidency for the 7th time on January 1st, 2025. And they hosted the Big Leaders Summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, June 15th to 17th, 2025. This was Prime Minister Mark Carney's first big international summit as PM. What was his plan going in?
Yeah, he seemed to have a pretty clear agenda. Canada's presidency focused on three main things: protecting communities and the world, uh, building energy security and speeding up the digital transition, and securing partnerships for the future. They also made a point of talking to people within Canada, including Indigenous partners, to help shape what they focused on. And leading up to Kananaskis, there were other important meetings. The four ministers met in Charlevoix, Quebec, and the finance ministers and central bank governors met in Banff, Alberta.
Okay, so the stage was set, the agenda was all planned out, but then reality hit, didn't it? Things got, as you said, upended almost right away.
They did.
The Iran-Israel conflict just blew up and shot straight to the top of the agenda. U.S. President Trump even left early to deal with it. What does that tell us about these summits when the carefully laid plans get tossed aside?
Well, I think it shows a basic truth about the G7, right? You can plan all you want, but these summits are always going to be reactive to whatever major geopolitical crisis flares up. It kind of highlights their role less as proactive agenda setters and maybe more as high-level crisis managers forced to pivot constantly. The G7 leaders did put out a statement saying, Israel has a right to defend itself, and they called Iran the principal source of regional instability and terror.
But even getting that statement agreed wasn't straightforward, was it? Reports suggest there was some internal wrangling over the exact words. Other leaders apparently wanted stronger language about de-escalation, maybe a ceasefire, which the U.S. wasn't keen on. So how does a consensus body actually work when you have such fundamental disagreements, like the U.S. position versus others on that issue?
Yeah, that's the constant tightrope walk, isn't it? And remember, this summit was also happening while President Trump's global trade war was ongoing with his tariffs. He made that statement about the U.S. being looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far. That certainly set a tone for some frank conversations, as diplomats like to say. Plus, you had the World Bank warning about the slowest decade for global growth since the 60s. So the economic mood was pretty tense, too.
Canada seemed to have learned something from that really sour 2018 summit in Charlevoix, where Trump left early and publicly attacked the Canadian PM. To avoid that kind of walkout this time, Canada cleverly decided not to aim for one big, single, final communiqué. Instead, they went for 6 shorter, separate joint statements on specific topics. That's smart diplomacy, right? Managing differences without breaking the whole thing apart.
It is smart, yeah. And it really speaks to how the G7 has to operate when there are deep divisions, especially with, let's face it, some strong personalities involved. But despite all those tensions, they did focus on continued support for Ukraine. That was still a major topic. President Zelensky was there talking about ongoing support, more sanctions on Russia, how to finance reconstruction. Canada made its own pledge, $4.3 billion, and announced more sanctions against Russia, too.
What's really interesting, though, is that some sources were talking about a divide, even a realignment of the world order, because the U.S. and some other G7 nations don't seem to be perfectly aligned on Ukraine anymore. That feels like a significant shift, even within this group of supposedly like-minded countries.
It does. And beyond those immediate crises, Canada also tried to push its own priorities. Things like harnessing AI, strengthening supply chains for critical minerals, integrating climate change discussions more like a joint response to forest fires. That last one was particularly relevant, obviously, after Canada's horrific wildfire season in 2023. And countering foreign interference was also definitely on the agenda.
And the guest list itself was pretty notable. Zelensky, okay, expected. But India's Prime Minister Modi was there too, even with those deeply strained relations with Canada over the killing of a Sikh separatist leader. But I guess India's economic clout meant he got an invite anyway.
Seems that way. Mexico's new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, was also invited for talks on North American trade, plus leaders from Australia, South Africa, South Korea, Indonesia, Brazil, and the heads of the EU and NATO. It was a crowded table.
So what was Prime Minister Carney's take on it all? Did he think the G7 is still relevant, especially if U.S. leadership is maybe less predictable?
He seemed to think so. He talked about the value of just having those leaders around the table talking to each other even when they disagreed. He felt it led to frank, open, very strategic exchanges, which kind of highlights the soft power aspect, maybe. Even if they don't agree on everything, just the act of talking is important.
Okay, so we've covered geopolitics, trade tensions. What about the global energy picture? That was a key Canadian priority, and it's huge. We're talking over 100 million barrels of oil consumed every day globally, and that's expected to go up, mostly driven by Asia.
Yeah, it's massive. The top producers are the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Canada. Top consumers, U.S., China, India, and there have been some big moves recently. OPEC Plus, which importantly includes Russia, decided to cut oil production again. That tightens supply, pushes prices up, and really hits vulnerable economies hard. What's also interesting is the whole U.S.-Saudi relationship, which is strained, let's say, and Saudi Arabia is playing this non-aligned game, especially regarding Russia and Ukraine.
And Russia itself, despite all the sanctions, they're still pumping out oil and selling it, right?
Yeah.
Just finding new customers.
Exactly. Selling it at a discount to places like Turkey, Singapore, China, India, often using these so-called shadow tankers to get around the sanctions. It just shows how adaptable the global energy market is, even when facing huge pressure.
Which really makes you think about the energy transition, doesn't it? We have the Paris Agreement, all this talk about net zero, but global oil demand isn't actually dropping significantly.
No, it's not. It's a super complex reality. You've got, say, Europe pushing hard on renewables. But then many developing countries, they just need more energy, period, for economic growth. And that often still means fossil fuels, at least for now. So the pace of transition is really uneven across the world.
What about nuclear power in all this? Is that seeing a comeback as a way to decarbonize?
It seems to be getting more attention, yeah. We're seeing new nuclear plants being built in China, Saudi Arabia's looking into it, and some countries that moved away from it, like France, Sweden, even Japan post-Fukushima, are now shifting back towards more nuclear. But it's still got challenges, it's incredibly expensive, and public perception is still a big hurdle in many places.
And then there's Africa, this energy paradox, huge need for energy access for economic development. But Western banks and institutions are often hesitant to fund new fossil fuel projects there. That raises big questions about fairness, doesn't it? How developed countries' climate policies impact the developing world.
It really does. It's a major point of tension.
Okay, so we've seen the G7 leaders dealing with these huge global issues, energy, security, conflict. But what happens when those same kinds of tensions, those debates about balancing priorities, play out right inside one of the member countries? Let's dig into this Canadian example, the Building Canada Act. It feels like a really fascinating domestic reflection of the global stuff we've been discussing.
It really is. So this act, it's technically part 2 of a big omnibus bill, C5. The basic goal is to speed up major infrastructure projects. And pretty much everyone in the Canadian Parliament agrees that, yeah, we need to build things faster. The controversy is all about how the bill tries to do it. Both the process it went through and the actual powers it creates are causing a lot of concern.
Right. Think about the G7 talking points, accelerating digital stuff, securing energy. This act is Canada trying to do that domestically, build its own infrastructure quicker. But it throws up that classic dilemma. How do democracies speed things up for the national interest without trampling on environmental rules or public input? This isn't just Canada's problem. It's exactly the kind of tension G7 leaders wrestle with globally, just brought down to the national level.
Precisely. And critics point to the process first. They say the bill was rushed through Parliament using something called a closure motion. That's a tactic the government can use to cut off debate and force a vote. It meant there was very limited time for discussion, for hearing from experts or witnesses. The Green Party leader said she'd never seen anything like this.
Okay, so the process was contentious. What about the substance? What powers does it actually grant?
This is where it gets particularly worrying for opponents. The bill gives what some call an insane amount of power to the federal cabinet, and specifically to one single minister who gets designated. This minister can approve projects if they're deemed in the national interest, but that term national interest isn't clearly defined in the bill. So the concern is that this minister could potentially just ignore things like environmental assessments or other recommendations if they decide a project is important enough. It kind of echoes worries about transparency in big international deals, right?
Yeah, it does. And this next bit sounds pretty alarming, too. There's a provision that apparently allows the government to basically delete laws from consideration for specific projects, like the tanker ban or the Impact Assessment Act.
That's correct. And that's raised huge fears that the government could just bypass environmental laws or other regulations whenever it wants for these big projects. It feels a bit like how sometimes countries look for loopholes in international climate agreements if it suits their economic needs.
Wow. Okay, so it's no surprise then that Indigenous groups are protesting.
Not at all. Groups like the Chiefs of Ontario are saying loud and clear that this bill undermines their treaty rights. They also point to the government's commitment to uphold the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRAP, specifically the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. They argue this bill flies in the face of that. And honestly, lawsuits seem almost certain, which could ironically end up delaying the very projects the bill is supposed to speed up.
Again, that mirrors global challenges, doesn't it? Balancing national development goals with human rights, especially for indigenous or vulnerable communities.
Absolutely.
So this whole domestic Canadian debate, it really shines a light on those bigger questions about governance, about transparency. Is there a risk of setting a dangerous precedent that weakens citizens' rights or environmental protections more broadly?
That's definitely the fear being expressed. It's a powerful reminder that those high-level G7 discussions about global economic stability and energy security aren't just abstract concepts. They have very real, sometimes very controversial consequences back home.
So as we wrap this up, it feels like the G7 is at a really interesting point, maybe even a crossroads. There are definitely critics questioning if it's still relevant.
Yeah, you hear that a lot. People point out that major players like China aren't in the room, other emerging powers aren't there. Some even argue the G20, which is broader, has kind of overtaken the G7 in terms of prestige or influence.
That's a strong argument. Yet you've made the case for its continued value. How do you square that circle? How can it still be valuable when consensus, even among its own members, seems so hard to achieve sometimes, and when big players are outside the tent?
Well, I think its value persists, maybe because its members face similar kinds of challenges, democratic challenges, economic challenges, security challenges. It remains this crucial space for those frank, open, very strategic exchanges that Prime Minister Carney mentioned. It's a place to try and build consensus among democracies that generally share values, even if they disagree strongly on specific policies. And maybe that informal structure, the lack of a rigid treaty, actually gives it an agility that bigger, more formal organizations sometimes lack.
Agility. So, looking forward, the G7 clearly needs to keep adapting, doesn't it? The world keeps changing. Power dynamics are shifting. You've got alternative groups like BRICS Plus getting stronger. Global challenges aren't going away. It sounds like a constant balancing act.
It absolutely is. That tension between their shared values on one hand and their often diverging national interests on the other, that's going to continue to shape everything the G7 does.
So here's a final thought for you, our listeners. As those G7 leaders left Kananaskis, they left behind not one big grand statement, but a series of shorter, specific ones. What does that shift signal about the future of global leadership? About how consensus gets built or maybe doesn't get built?
Yeah, will that informal, flexible nature be enough for the G7 to stay relevant in a world that feels increasingly fragmented? Or will the internal disagreements, the external pressures from other power blocs eventually push towards new ways of cooperating internationally, maybe involving more countries?
It's definitely something to watch. How these advanced economies navigate that tricky balance between shared ideals and national priorities. The next few years could really determine the future path for this influential group.